Hi, welcome back to Macabre History with M. In today's episode, we are looking at the Black Death fighting a losing battle. So, the Black Death, what is it, how did it happen, and why did so many people die? These are some of the questions we'll be covering today. In today's episode, we are looking at Europe and how the West dealt with the plague. This is just due to major differences between how Europe and Islamic communities and the East dealt with the pandemic. If you'd like me to look more into sort of healthcare and science from the medieval Islamic communities, just let me know, as I find it such an interesting and pioneering time. But now let's get back to Europe and the Black Death. What was the Black Death? The Black Death was a pandemic that ravaged Europe during 1347 to 1351. Modern science has found that the Black Death and the Great Plague in 1665 have been caused by the same bacteria, Yersinia pestis bacterium. The term Black Death was first used in the English language years after the initial pandemic in the 1700s. Most historians agree that people would have called the disease the pestilence or the Great Mortality during the actual time of the Black Death. But why was it called the Black Death though? To answer this question, we need to look at how the disease actually affected the human body and the variations of this bacteria. The Yersinia bacteria can cause three main variations of plague: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. During the Black Death, bubonic and pneumonic variations of the plague were most common. Pneumonic plague involves an extensive infection of the lungs and respiratory system. The symptoms include fever, shortness of breath, and a cough. Pneumonic plague quickly affects the lungs and causes a large build-up of fluid in the lungs, and death would occur within 3 to 4 days after initial infection. Due to the symptoms of pneumonic plague, i.e. sneezing, coughing, this variation of the plague was extremely infectious. This plague was also the only variation in which humans could spread the disease between themselves, as the bacteria was in the droplets coughed and sneezed by the patient, going on to infect other people. And also, pneumonic plague has a mortality rate of 100%, meaning if you caught pneumonic plague, you are going to die. Bubonic plague made up nearly 3/4 of all plague cases within the time of the Black Death. The symptoms can involve fever, vomiting, diarrhea, buboes, which are swollen pus-filled boils in the armpit, neck and groin, and acral necrosis, which is darkening and the death of the tissue, usually in the fingers and toes. The mortality rate of bubonic plague ranges between 50 to 60%. So, with the necrosis of the fingers and toes and the blackening of the pus-filled boils, it is easy to see why this pandemic was labelled the Black Death. So where did this come from, and how did it spread to Europe? Well, for this we need to look at trader links and routes such as the Silk Road during the Middle Ages. The Silk Road was an ancient trade route that linked the Western world with the Middle East and Asia. It was a major conduit for trade between the Roman Empire and China, and later between medieval European kingdoms and China. Why is this relevant, you're probably asking? Well, the Black Death, and specifically the bubonic plague, was transmitted by fleas living on rats. The fleas from the rats would jump onto the humans and bite them and pass the plague on. Where there is produce and communities, there will be rodents. The Black Death would also travel across nations via trade ships. The rats would board these ships, and then once this ship has docked, they would escape the ship and spread the plague to the new country. During the period of the Black Death, some scientists and historians have stated that the pandemic spread about a mile a day, which doesn't sound very fast, but in the 4 years most of the world was infected, and it had killed 50% of the infected populations. With most of Europe infected, how did the medieval people treat the disease, and who was responsible for treating it? For this answer, we need to look at the physicians of the time. When people hear the words plague doctor, the typical image of beaked masks, long black robes tend to pop into your head. But why did they wear this uniform? Was it to look the part, or was it to do with the actual disease? Let's deconstruct the uniform to their individual components and investigate the effectiveness at preventing the physician from falling victim to the plague. So first, the infamous beaked mask. People in the Middle Ages believed in the miasma theory, which essentially was the belief that disease was spread by bad smells. The beaked part of the mask would be stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices such as lavender, cloves, dried flowers, and sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges. The physician believed that filtering the smell would neutralise the plague before it was breathed in. But how effective was it? Although infamous during the plague pandemics, the bead mask did prevent the wearer from cough droplets or splattered fluids. However, they did not prevent the wearer from flea bites or aerosolized bacteria that would make its way through the mask and through the herbs. So it was effective from being a physical barrier to the infection, but also fleas were able to get through the holes in the masks and bite the wearer. Next, let's look at the clothes the doctors wore. The coats and gloves were often covered in oil or wax, and the coats would be floor length. This was designed to create a waterproof barrier to protect the wearer from bodily fluids and to stop the miasma from getting through the fabric, and the wax made it easier for the doctors to wipe down and clean. Underneath the coat, the doctor would ensure their garments were tucked in, with no bare skin exposed. The coats that were worn by the doctors, they work surprisingly well at protecting them. This is because the sticky, slick barrier made by the oil and wax made it impossible for infected fleas to grip the coat and therefore unable to bite through the fabric and unable to pass on the disease. Many plague doctors would also carry a cane. This was used mainly as a medical tool to which doctors would examine the patient without need for physical contact. However, there was also a use for the cane that probably would not uphold the Hippocratic Oath today, as the doctors would use the cane to strike patients either as treatment for the disease or to keep the infected away from them. The cane was somewhat effective in preventing the spread of disease, as it encouraged social distancing from the patient, and as a recent pandemic has shown, social distancing can be a crucial part in preventing the spread of diseases. So what did the doctors think caused the disease? As we briefly discussed above, one of the main theories of the causes of the plague was miasma, or bad smells. However, there is another theory that we'll need to look into to fully explore this question, which is the theory of the four humours. This theory was the ancient medical framework proposing the human body was made up of four fundamental fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile and phlegm. For someone to be in good health, all four liquids need to be in perfect balance. Illnesses and disease were believed to be caused by excess or deficiencies of these bodily fluids. So with the Black Death, doctors believe this was caused by major imbalances, specifically with blood and black bile in the body. We will be looking a little bit more in depth in this later on in the episode. Another very popular theory that people believe caused the plague was that it was a punishment from God. This is because at the time of the plague, science and religion was very deeply intertwined. The Catholic Church taught that the human body and soul were bound together, therefore physical sickness was directly linked to spiritual corruption. If entire communities fell ill, like many did in the Middle Ages, it was assumed that the community had angered God, and this was their punishment. Medieval scholars and citizens also relied heavily on biblical history to explain what was happening around them. This can be seen in the Old Testament, where God had released multiple plagues on the people of Egypt, as well as the story of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, one of these horsemen being pestilence, so disease. So now we have looked into some of the medieval causes of the plague, let's delve into some of the treatments for the disease. Some which were helpful and some which were just downright weird and wacky. A popular and relatively simple treatment was bloodletting and leeching. This relates to the humours theory and the belief that disease was caused by too much of one liquid. In this case, bloodletting was used to get rid of the excess blood in the body, and it realigned the humours. This would have been done by cutting the patient and placing leeches onto the wound to encourage the feeding of the corrupted blood. As you can imagine, this did not help cure or treat the patient and actively shortened the lifespan of the infected. This is due to bloodletting weakening the immune system and stripping the patient of valuable white blood cells needed to fight the infection. Another relatively simple procedure the plague doctors would conduct was lancing. This involved the practice of the doctor or surgeon slicing open the buboes in the groin, neck and armpits and draining the pus from the boils, and then placing a red-hot iron onto the wound to cauterize it. The doctors did this because they saw patients whose buboes would burst, and they would sometimes survive this, and naturally concluded that bursting the boils was the only way and one of the best ways to treat the Black Death. Unsurprisingly, this treatment still didn't cure the plague, and modern science has proved this has caused further infection rates and further mortality rates. With the buboes, the body has naturally isolated the infection, preventing the infection from entering the bloodstream. When the boils were lanced, it was releasing millions of the highly infectious bacteria directly into the surrounding tissue and blood vessels, increasing the risk that patient was suffering from septicemic plague, which is very, very high mortality rate as well. Now let's go into some slightly more out there treatments. The Vickery method. Now, you've probably not heard this name before, but if I mention it includes armpits and chickens, you may clock what this method includes. Well, if you still have no idea what I'm talking about, let's look into it. The Vickery method includes plucking the backside of a chicken, and the chicken would then be strapped directly onto the open boil to draw out the poison. Another treatment that is relatively crazy compared to modern science is ingesting heavy metals. Drinking small doses of mercury, arsenic, or powdered gold and emeralds would force the body to purge the toxins that are causing the plague. So as well as the plague, you are now suffering with mercury poisoning, which is a really, really miserable way to die by the sounds of it. Now, if you don't have the money for powdered gold or emeralds, there was a more spiritual way citizens of the medieval times believed they could cure the Black Death. There were methods of self-flagellation, mass prayer processions, and public fasting. Self-flagellation involves whipping yourself while travelling from town to town for 33.5 days. The whipping was to symbolise the suffering Christ suffered before his death on the cross, and the travelling for 33.5 days was to symbolise the number of years Christ lived on earth. So how effective was these treatments? We looked briefly at the effectiveness of bloodletting and lancing, and I think we can agree that they were not great at preventing and curing the plague, but the doctors were just trying to prolong life at that time. I'm still not quite sure on the purpose of strapping chicken bums to open wounds. I'm not quite sure how the doctors came to that conclusion, but hey, it wasn't really until the germ theory became relevant that people were becoming more aware that it wasn't miasma causing disease and it was actually germs. So while the plague doctors were treating patients, there was a common belief that the dirtier the doctor's coat, the better they were. And so doctors weren't cleaning their coats, they weren't cleaning their hands or instruments, and they'd go from seeing one family, treating that family, to then going on to the next and passing the infection on further. And this was causing a more infectious plague and a more infectious time to be there. So how did the Black Death end? What happened? So by the end of 1351, it was estimated between 25 to 50 million people had died from the Black Death in Europe. Entire villages were abandoned, major cities such as London had lost up to half of their population. The disease didn't just vanish overnight, instead it transitioned from an uncontrollable pandemic into smaller, localised outbreaks. One way this was encouraged was by household lockdowns. Once a member of the family was identified as showing symptoms of the plague, the entire family were entombed in their home for up to 40 days. To identify these homes, a large red cross was painted over the door and often accompanied by the prayer, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Another way communities encouraged isolation and lockdowns on larger scales were isolation islands, which can be seen in Venice. Venice built the world's first permanent plague hospitals on isolated Venetian lagoons. The Lazaretto Vecchio was used to treat the sick, whilst the Lazaretto Nuovo served as a detention camp to decontaminate incoming cargo and crews. Although the spread of the disease was slowed and managed, the Black Death and other plagues were not cured or eradicated until the 1800s with the discovery of the germ theory and introduction of modern antibiotics which easily kills the bacteria. So that's today's episode. We were just having a brief overlook of the Black Death and some of the ways it was treated, some of the cures, some of the causes of the plague during the medieval times. If you have any questions or follow-up comments, please leave them below. And again, if you have any topic ideas that you want to see, just let me know. Until next time, guys.